Hello, well there's so many different ways you can cut leather. You get complicated shapes, easy shapes, repeatable shapes, and you get lots of different tools for cutting it. So I thought I'd demystify cutting out leather. Sounds basic, but it gets pretty complex, and show you some of the tools you can use and which ones I think are best for different applications. Now the traditional tool for cutting out leather shapes is the saddler's half moon knife. And if you're new to leather work, you're probably thinking, oh, I should go out and buy one of these. They're quite expensive. I wouldn't particularly recommend them if you're starting out. And the reason for that is actually that they're quite dangerous. If you get them properly sharpened, which this one is, then you've got a lot of exposed edge and you've got quite nasty corners there. And by properly sharpened, this is 5mm leather, you should be able to just cut it like that. So that is sharp. Of course, you imagine putting your hand in a tool bag to pull that out and you could have a nasty injury. So I always keep it covered, and I'd say be a bit careful if you're new. If you're new to leather work, I'd actually recommend these cutters. Now, these are ordinary patchwork rotary cutters and they come in different blade sizes. The reason I particularly like them is that you have this safety cover around them and they're very effective. So I mean, again, I have a thick 5mm bit of leather and you can be through it quite easily. You can strop the blade to give it a newer edge, although they seem to last a very long time. And I'd recommend, if you do consider one of these, that you get the larger blade because it will last longer and it can go through deeper leather and it's generally a bit easier. But the small blade version is perfectly good, so if you've got one of those knocking around, I'd thoroughly recommend it. The half moon knife, of course, is a little bit more flexible because you can cut curves. You can use the end of it and then you can cut out nice curve shapes. But the other thing about this is it's a lot of edge to maintain, to keep sharp, and that obviously takes time and it takes a certain amount of practice. So if you're starting out, certainly recommend these. If you want to go for a traditional knife like this, and it is very nice for things like skiving, I would recommend you go for the quarter moon, which is this shape. So if I lay one on top of the other, you can see that's the half moon, and this one, it's half of a half moon, it's a quarter moon. Far easier to keep sharp, less dangerous because there's less exposed blade and obviously only one very sharp corner. Now these knives, as I say, are great for cutting straight lines. They're less easy to use on curves, particularly tighter curves. And if you're fairly new to leather work, I would certainly recommend one of these clicker knives. So all it is, it's a nice wooden handle, a disposable blade, but actually again you can resharpen and strop these blades. This one's got the sort of hooky claw, which makes it ideal for cutting curves, hence the term clicker knife used to be used for cutting out shoe soles and shoe parts in the shoe industry. So that's a good basic knife to have. If you have those two, you can do most cutting out jobs. So certainly recommend that. You can get different blades for these, so I always have two on my bench. I have the curved blade and I have the straight blade version. The straight blade version is quite useful if you're just wanting to rough up pieces prior to gluing, so you can just scrape along and then your glue will take better key, particularly if it's going on to a smooth glazed bit of leather. But I think if you've got those two, you're well away. With this kind of knife, you can just unscrew the handle and then you can pull the blade out. It's as simple as that. Now here's another knife I think it's worth having if you're starting out. I would recommend getting one of these. There is a skiving knife and it's used for like thinning off the edge of a piece of leather. So where you perhaps want to splice two bits of leather together, you can cut it off at an angle and then join them. A bit exaggerated on this thick bit, and normally what you do is you'd put it down on the board and gently slice away. You get a nice skived edge. But this kind of skiving knife, this is one you can get off the likes of eBay for really virtually next to nothing, but the steel of the blade is extremely good. And I have popped a separate film up on these. I'll put a link in the description below. But they're very good, very cheap. So you can get going for less than $10, £10 UK, with your cutting there with those two knives. Now a pair of scissors. But these are no ordinary scissors. They're very good for leather work, these particular ones. If you're working with a lot of thin leather, so I have a piece, it's actually a split, but it's about 1.5 millimeters thick, very roughly. You can use scissors, and you can obviously cut out curves and what have you. The key feature of these scissors is that they've got a serrated edge, and that actually grips the leather in the scissor jaw, so the leather doesn't slide out. With conventional scissors, you'd find the leather would slide forward and be quite difficult to cut. With these scissors, you can actually, they grip it, they do slide a bit, but not nearly as much, and you can successfully cut bits of leather with them. Now when you're cutting out a straight edge, you obviously will need some form of ruler, and you can get different lengths of ruler. This particular ruler is very useful if you're cutting out shorter lengths, because it's a safety ruler, and there are two key features about it. One is it's got like a thicker raised cutting edge, so this cutting edge is about 4.5 millimeters thick. And the other thing about it is it has a rubber grip underneath. So what it means is when you put it on your bench for cutting and you're using a knife, you can sit the knife blade nice and square against the ruler, and you'll get a nice square cut. And the ruler, because it's rubber underneath, it doesn't sort of slide around, it's nice and firm. So very useful to have. This particular one is called a Linex, L-I-N-E-X, made in Denmark, and it's very good. The other pretty key essential, if you're cutting, in my opinion, is to have a self-healing cutting mat. Now these are useful for two reasons. One is you can obviously cut right angles with them because they're marked out in grids. So if you want a right angle, you can just line up with your lines as you cut them. The other obvious thing is they are self-healing. So if you cut, you're not damaging your knife edge. You can cut straight onto them, cut a line, and the mat closes in on itself. So you're not damaging this cutting edge, and the line where you've cut goes. So it's a self-healing cutting mat, and you can get them in different sizes, but they're really useful, and I always have my bench covered in these mats, and then I can cut anywhere I like on the bench and know that I'm not damaging my cutting tools. But if you're needing to cut very long hides, you can get one of these like decorator rulers. I'm going to talk about clicker cutters in a minute for cutting out lots of repeatable shapes, but just before we get onto that, just want to quickly make reference to a circle cutter, and that's what I have here. And this tool is very useful if you want to cut out perfect leather circles, such as for coasters or perhaps base of tankards or things like that. It's called a circle cutter. I have put a separate film up on using this circle cutter, so again I will put a link in the description. If you need to cut out lots of leather shapes and you want repeatability and accuracy, there is a lot to be said for having some clicker dies made. Now these are like cookie cutters, and they're basically like steel cutting edge, normally either wrapped around a former or welded together. But in all cases, I mean, this is a wallet T section here, And I'll show you in a minute in the press how this works, but you can cut out repeatable shapes very quickly and very accurately. So it's ideal for things like making wallets. In my Leathercraft playlist, you will find various examples where I show you making these. I wouldn't particularly recommend you go down the road of trying it yourself, although it is quite interesting. But you can get them commercially made, and something like this sort of thing, which has been commercially made, is lovely and solid. They're not cheap to have made, but obviously if you're making a lot of an item, then it does become cost effective, because it's a huge time saving and you are increasing your accuracy. So if you're going for volume output, it's certainly worth having something in the way of these clicker dies. You need some form of press to work them, and if you've just got small ones like a T-section, you would probably just about get away with a 2-ton arbor press. But once you go above this sort of size, so once you're going for this sort of size, you do need a more powerful press. And again, I've popped films up on using various. A garage hydraulic press is quite a good option as a cheap option, or you can obviously buy a more sort of purpose-made clicker press, either a large hydraulic one or a manual one if you want to. Again, obviously you're talking about quite high volume production to recoup the costs of a large press, but it is another cutting option. So here I have a little tongue of leather that I want to cut out, and I've got a manual 4-ton press here. So it has a big lever. I put my lever to be cut on the bed there, put my cutter down, and then I can swing it round and put it down. Doesn't take huge effort, and you get that nice little grunty noise. Lift it up, then I've cut out my shape. So there you are, my little tongue of leather has been cut out very quickly. Very useful for things like wallets. So that's a few different ways of cutting out leather shapes. Worth making, just as an aside, a little comment about sharpening leather tools. So to get your tools lovely and sharp, I use diamond stones. So here's an example. It's a heavy steel plate coated in monocrystalline diamonds, and I find them very good. I have a 600 and a 1200 grit, and it will get your blade nice and sharp. What I then do is actually strop them. So I have a bit of leather there, top grain leather, and I use a bit of usually green compound, or can use white or yellow. I've got them all for various applications. You just put a bit on, and then you can just go up and down with a knife blade and get a nice sharp edge. I have popped again another film up on sharpening, so I'll pop a link in the description for that as well. You can get Flex Cut, do a nice little wooden mould if you want to be sharpening up some of your edge tools, like for rounding over edges or beveling edges, and that comes with a little bit of stropping compound as well. So that's by Flex Cut, who do carving tools. But you can make your own little paddles up and just stick a bit of leather on. I have a softer one here which I use sometimes, and you can get various other ones on the likes of eBay. If you just put in strop or stropping, you'll find the sorts of things coming up. But that's how I get a nice sharp edge on my cutting tools. Anyway, hope that little sort of introduction to cutting covers a few of the things and gives you a little bit of food for thought if you're embarking on a leather journey. Thanks very much for watching, and I'll be doing quite a few films like this covering all the sort of main ground areas. So if you haven't already, please subscribe, and you know what to do about the bell. You hit that notification bell. Thanks so much for watching. Bye bye then.